10x your service design offering with Smaply. Take 20% off any order with This Is HCD 20 off. Let's superpower you and your design team's potential. Sign up at smaply.app. Enjoy the episode from your friends at Smaply, helping support This Is HCD podcast.
Welcome to CultureCast, the podcast that focuses on culture in its broadest sense, from putting people back at the heart of organisational culture through to the seismic shifts taking place in society every single day. My name's Gareth and I'm from Honey Badger, a UK business that focuses on designing and delivering measurable change to organisations through experience and culture. Today on the podcast, I've got Richard Gahagan of Adam Recruitment. Richard is one of those rare people in the recruitment industry that's authentic in the way that he approaches the importance of organisational culture to both the organisation and the individuals that make it what it is. I found it really interesting to talk to him about the importance of culture to the private sector, and some of the topics we got into around data and organisational employee alignment I found really interesting. Anyway, I hope that you find it as interesting to listen to as I did to record it. Thanks. Hi, it's Gareth from Honey Badger, and today I'm talking about culture with Richard Gahagan from weareadam.com. Richard's got a long-standing, well-known recruitment business, but has a very particular focus around organisational culture and individual culture, which I thought would be an interesting topic for discussion. Hope you all enjoy it. Thanks. Welcome, Richard. Thought we'd get started today by asking a pretty open-ended question. Gives a bit of background about yourself and what you're working on at the moment.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. And CEO of Adam Recruitment. We've been around now for nearly 15 years. We are specialists very much in HR, digital marketing and tech, hiring for all manner of sectors and industries, from SME to large corporates. And that business has obviously evolved hugely as the market's kind of gone down the route of technology. And as we'll talk about later on, we've started to realise that we're sat really on a mountain of information and data that we do for our clients. So now very often we'll do a little bit more than just recruitment for them. But essentially that is still the core of our business.
Great. So I think the best way of getting started really is to set the scene for what we're going to talk about, is get your take on essentially what culture means to you.
Yeah, sure. For me, culture, it's a funny one. You could talk for hours about it, but I think culture is very much the personality of a business. It's the thing that knits any business together. It's the thing I always think, obviously we deal with a lot of candidates and clients. Very often a candidate will come to us and it's the first thing they'll say is, the reason I work here is here, or the reason I'm leaving this company is for this reason. And often it is the culture. And it's so important when you think about, how you choose your friends, deeper emotional relationships, that sort of thing. It's exactly the same in business. For me, culture has always been hugely important, but I think it's become more important because people have realised that you want to show your personality at work. You want to be valued as a person. Whereas perhaps if you sort of flash back to corporate world in sort of 50s, 60s, 70s, you look at businesses then and it was very much more around what you could earn, what the business was, what it'd do for your career. Whereas I think now people are looking for a lot more than that. And obviously that's been made a lot more prevalent by businesses doing that really well, whether it's perception or reality. People like Google changing the sort of face of a business, very much making it a place that's a destination. I think it became something that lots of other businesses tried to replicate. But again, as we'll probably come on to, I also hugely value businesses that you would actually argue there's some big horror stories about culture. Businesses that are phenomenally successful, like even Apple, who are absolutely exceptional, but you hear lots of stories about them being particularly brutal in the way they execute and almost that being a strength. So I think culture doesn't necessarily mean it's a soft culture or a certain type of culture, but it is definitely the personality that makes business tick.
It's a very good way of summarising it. Just on that point, one of the big things that I know and that I've seen about Adam Recruitment is that you very much focus on aligning the culture and the vision of the business with the goals and the vision of the individual. So when you're sort of talking about there's all these different types of culture and there's no necessarily right or wrong, how do you assess a business culture and establish what it might be and understand that so that when you're talking to an individual and whether they're going to be the right fit, get under the hood of it, get to the detail, as it were?
Yeah, I think traditionally it was very, very simple. We would almost interview the client. So ideally with certainly a larger client, you'd get to know the MD or the senior team, you'd get to know the hiring managers, you'd hope to get to know the HR team. And you can generally pick up a consistency, which is the internal vibe. And a lot of businesses are very honest as well. They won't just tell you the good stuff when you're hiring. For example, some of the hires we'll make are actually to fix issues around culture. But how we assess it internally is, to talk to people, to interview. And even when we talk a little bit later on about the fact that we kind of gather all this data now for our clients, generally from candidates to begin with, generally from people who've left the business. And we're able to build a very, very accurate picture as to what are people actually saying about them. In some cases, it might be harsh. It might be a case of, you always get bad leavers and people who might criticise the culture. But generally, you get a fairly accurate picture. And you've got tools, obviously, online, been around for years, like Glassdoor, but I don't always think that they reflect enough of the positive. The people actually work there helps massively.
So just to take that a bit further, I think it's probably fair to say the recruitment industry hasn't always had the best reputation in understanding and maybe caring or about organisational culture and individuals' goals. So do you think that's a fair assessment, or what do you think's wrong in your industry?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. I get asked it all the time, and I have. It's one of those sort of, if you like, dinner party questions where people always sort of say, "Oh, I've had a nightmare with a recruitment company" or something like that. The chances are it's a very valid criticism. What people have got to remember is there's I think 50,000 people work in recruitment, not including people who are in house. 10,000 companies do it, and there's such a spectrum of. If you talked about lawyers or accountants, they get kind of criticised for certain things and kind of all, if you like, tarred with the same brush. What I'd say is very true, though, is if a recruitment business chooses to work in a certain market, they are going to be a reflection to the candidates of that business that they are hiring for. And likewise, they're a reflection of the candidates they deal with. So if you're dealing with people who, dare I say it, less experienced or let you down, or clients that are using 10 different recruitment companies and really all they want are CVs fired in, the chances are you're not going to give a very, very good experience to candidates. And candidates will feel let down that you're not giving the time of day to get back to people. And we've studied with surveys, certainly for us, Adam came around from a branding exercise where we wanted to be personable. We went to a creative agency and they just said, and in essence, a lot of recruiters also put their own names on it, and we didn't want to do that either, partly because my name's a bit of a mouthful. But the kind of branding theme was get to know us from Adam. And we wanted every candidate to know us, every client, as an individual, and whoever works for us, therefore, it's almost like immediately there's like a code of conduct that's how good you've got to be. But I get the fact that if we were to work with every man and his dog hiring business, and including people who just want cheap recruitment, including people who don't perhaps treat their own staff well, let alone the people they're trying to hire, or even just businesses that are very, very good at what they do, but they're not particularly good at hiring. If you don't get under the skin of that early on, you just end up letting the candidates down. And the classic, and I certainly won't be naming any names, but way back years ago, I remember dealing with a person, shall we say, sales and marketing director. And they've been really, really quite rightly keen to get feedback at every stage and all that. And I was always very, very good at that. Went into their business and was hiring, and they were just too busy for it. And I had to remind them, say, look, only a month or two ago, you were a candidate. So I can only be as good to my candidates now as you're going to be with me. And it's that sort of circle. So, it's a passion of mine, because I do think it's tarnished the whole industry. And I don't think that'll ever go away. And it's also not helped by, there are certain spammers on LinkedIn that I think them are recruiters. There's a load of spammers when email marketing was perhaps bigger than it is today. Yeah, it's not great, but there's certainly plenty of good ones I can say as well. And certainly in every sector I kind of refer business to, I know there's some great businesses at the top of every market.
Yeah, I suppose it's true of almost all businesses, really, or any organisation. Doesn't necessarily need to be a business. There's going to be a spread of capabilities depending on how much time and effort they put into what's important to them.
Exactly, and it's like any market where you've got the cheap suppliers and you've got the really high-end ones. So whether you talk about cars or anything else, it's the same in the service sector.
And if you were a kind of individual wanting to kind of assess them, looking at possibly joining an organisation, changing an organisation, dealing with recruiters, how would you say that they should be able to kind of assess it for themselves? What should they be looking for in working out what a good culture looks like, and the kind of questions they might ask, or what kind of practical tips might you give people?
The first thing is you've got to build a relationship, or at least understand if you're not going to get one. So depending on the level of role you're applying for, even a senior role, that recruiter might be dealing with 200 or 300 applicants across perhaps 50 people. So you've got to get an understanding of, are they being honest, transparent? Can you get as much information out of them as you can? To then understand if that headhunter or recruiter is good and knows their own client, they should be able to do a lot of that due diligence for you. And I think that's a good starting point. If you're lacking that information, though, and even if you're not lacking that information, it's critical you do your own due diligence. Some of the simplest questions, will allow you to understand how good a business is, how seriously they take their people, and what are their objectives. Why did the last person leave a role? What's the most senior hire you've made recently? Really, really simple questions that give you a kind of subtle picture of staff turnover. Has that business actually really stuck to its mission, its culture, that sort of thing? Got to treat it as a two-way interview process. Yeah, if you're looking for a role, of course you need to impress them. Of course you need to research, get to know what kind of makes them tick. But the quality of your questioning will enable you not only to find out if the job's right for you, but obviously if that business is actually ethical. Have they got any financial issues? It's all kind of laid out, really. And
Mm,
it's about how intuitive you are and how much you dare to ask questions in an interview as well. I think
yeah.
people don't do that and regret it a few weeks later.
I won't say I know from experience, but I've seen it via other people's experiences that I've worked with. But just stepping aside, probably stepping away from the recruitment in and of itself, because one of the reasons I want to speak to you is that you're well known and you've built a successful and well regarded business in and of its own right. And I would say that a large part of that is due to the culture that you built within the business. So how have you gone about that? What are some good examples of what does a good organisational culture look like? And how have you done that within your own business?
So I'd be really honest to start with and say we've done it really well at times and we've done it really badly at times, I think, and we've learned as much from each period of that sort of growth. So I think the first thing is to go externally and not expect that you know all the answers. So plugging businesses, it's probably not fair on this to sort of pick out one, but we've worked with a couple of people who are exceptional at pulling a team together, looking at what makes the team tick, looking at what the sort of the mission and where the business is actually going, and actually getting the team aligned and on board with the culture. And one example I'd give is if there's somebody, if we even make mistakes for recruitment business, but we make mistakes to the hiring. If you make a mistake generally, and I think that's a good sign that they feel like they own it, it's their business. I think one of the mistakes that lots of business, particularly businesses that are much bigger than us, if the team don't believe it's their hire or their colleague or that they own it, very often they'll kind of abdicate responsibility if they see bad practice or if they see something's not right or they don't give a shit about the job. Obviously, in any other walk of life, if you feel like that person has joined your football team or your friends group or whatever it might be, they get wheedled out, and it should be exactly the same in business. And then really after that, it's just making sure people are empowered. So anything as small as we moved office a year ago and how the office looks and feels, the bits that matter to people, it's just us not trying to make out as though we know all the answers and allowing the team to ultimately, if they are making those decisions, it's what's right for them rather than what's right for me or what's right for the leadership team. But it's constant hard work, and the faster you're growing, the harder it is as well. Well, we grew far too quickly about 4 or 5 years ago, and you just can't help but creak at the seams. You're onboarding people. I'm talking about sort of we hired probably grew by 40% headcount one year, and it was really, when you look back, it was too much, too quick, not enough of our own due diligence and that sort of thing. And inevitably, a year later, you look at the data of it, and we spent a fortune, didn't really do a lot for the business, and we learned a hell of a lot, and we've never done that since. But we also learned a lot that we can now use for some of our clients as well, which is good.
Couple of things interest me. The aspect of ownership of the business by the team internally, and it's something that I speak to people time and time again about, and I've had it in my own business of people don't treat it as if they were their own business or don't seem to care. And it seems to be a big challenge. Sometimes those frustrations might be valid, but my personal opinion is that more often than not, it's unfair to expect people to treat somebody else's business as if it were their own, which is we'd all like that to be the case. From a practical point of view, how have you managed to build that sense of ownership within the business, and how have you seen good businesses that you work with do that?
So, starting with other businesses, that you can obviously look at things such as employee ownership and those sorts of things. But I totally buy into your point, which is if they don't actually own it, then they're probably never going to feel how the owners do. And to be honest, probably don't actually want to, because I do believe that if people did want to, they'd probably go off and set up their own business. However, I do think a lot of people care to a level, whether that be the office socials or whether it's the way the office physically looks or it's across the board, things that are very, very specifically important to them. So I think you can break it down into somebody who manages a team, it's their team, and how do they own that. But I think a lot of it's just sensible two-way communication and actually making it part of their appraisal process, part of everything that you talk about. So as much as performance is important for a business, for the individual, it's important that your boss or your team know exactly you want to get out of that day, out of that week, or out of that project. And I think that brings a lot of ownership. So there are certain things that we've done where literally there was nobody in the senior leadership team got involved in, and it was run brilliantly, and nor did we want to get involved or needed to be involved. And then, of course, you've got that transition that there are some people who start their career and they don't want to own anything, but obviously that can change. And certainly we've got people who've done that and become directors, and we're even looking at potentially employee ownership ourselves. So I do buy into that concept that you're never really going to act like an owner until you actually do own it.
Okay. And then something else that you mentioned, I totally agree that maybe more dangerous than not making enough money is essentially growing too fast. It's the biggest cause of business failure and system failure within non-government departments is dealing with rapid growth. So when you talk about learning the lessons from growing too fast in the past and you're not doing that again, how do you actually approach that? How do you kind of stop yourself from growing? Or I tell people all the time, they say, that's great. Well, I can't say no. How have you managed that whole challenge?
So one of the areas is certainly that in our market, it's very, very distinct in terms of where you want to play. A little bit like I'd use the analogy of, let's say, the car industry. It's very, very obvious if you're Bentley that you don't want to be selling low cost, high volume cars.
Yeah.
And I don't believe it's any different in our sector as well. So we essentially had to look at where we're strong, look at what makes a good client for us, look at the everything down to the price point, that sort of thing. And we thought we can grow profit, we can grow kind of sales turnover to a degree, but we can also grow massively on headcount. But we definitely can't do all of those things. So which are important, which fit with our values. And so we looked at the quality of the service that we offer. We looked at being a premium product. We looked at being assignment based only. Believe it or not, there's an old stat that we used to, in fact, I'm not going to share the percentage, it's that embarrassing, but a very, very high percentage of jobs that we used to work on were put on hold. And we're talking more than half. People would have roles out to lots of businesses, that sort of stuff. So we just literally had to look at it and say, it's not that we're not ambitious, it's not that we don't want to grow. When we find really good people, we'll hire them, but we're not obsessed by it. Our growth doesn't come simply by hiring somebody and that person now has to generate sales, which I think there's a lot of people in the service sector do that. I think certainly lawyers do it, accountancy firms do it, recruitment firms definitely do. It was moving away from that and just being brave enough to think, well, we don't, what's the point? There's no glory in your head count. It's about running a decent business.
Out of interest, have you ever, I've done this myself a number of times, where you've essentially cost yourself money by doing the right thing? Have you ever, you're working with a potential customer or a potential business who's wanting to grow really, really quickly and hiring and sort of made them rethink it or reconsidered and tried to get them to slow down, even though it would have been to your own detriment?
100%. Yeah, I mean, I'd actually say it's gone from being something that we were proud that we once did, probably occasionally, to something that we do could even be half the time, a third of the time. Right. So we'll often get people to tail back, and you can just tell, if somebody was kind of a bit hesitant about how much they want to pay or the process is lagging, you could tell kind of without knowing all the data behind it, there was a problem there. And so what we did was we realized that perhaps 10 years ago, we wanted to differentiate ourselves as a much more high quality business that I guess was more consultative. And we realized that those questions and that data was critical to proving to a client that actually, should you even be hiring this role yet? Can you actually afford it? If a sales director wants 100 grand and they want 100 grand OT, let's say it's 200k. How many businesses work that out in the same way a private equity house would, which is that's probably going to cost you 400k if that goes wrong. They just literally double that number. Whereas what we're doing is actually digging into the data of looking and saying, well, actually, if that doesn't work out, you've spent X, Y, and Z on everything from management, legal, training, you go right across the board of what that could cost. And you very quickly get to a point where you do put people off hiring immediately. And hopefully what they'll do is they'll trust us and respect us enough that when they do come back to it, and we can now help them come back to the table with what they do want to do. Or if it's a multiple assignment, what we might say is, well, look, pick off the priorities. Let's do that first and do it well, and then come back to the other things, rather than trying to, I guess the classic is we've just had a £3 million investment fundraise round. And it's almost like they're trying to spend it all in the first 3 months on hiring. And you just think, oh my, it just scares the hell out of me.
Yeah.
That's because that's not something I've ever done or would do. But I think it's very understandable why they've got those downward pressures. But I think, it's just getting under the data. It's being really, really honest with people and really challenging. And do you know what? We've also put people off. There are some people who don't think that that's our job to ask those questions. And if that's the case, I'm certainly fine with that as long as they're doing it themselves. And if they neither do it themselves or want us to do it, then I guess that qualifies them as somebody that I think for us is too high risk and probably will fail in what they're doing.
You also talked about speaking to your customers and businesses about essentially something that I talk about a lot is the assessing the financial return, breaking it down into numbers. Because that, as a business owner or as a senior manager, who's managing budget, you ultimately, every time we're trying to, this whole area of building company culture and engaging with teams and improving company culture, ultimately there's got to be some kind of return on that investment. So how do you kind of broker that conversation? How do you approach it? Have you got any kind of advice for people who might be trying to get buy-in from senior management or business owners into sort of doing the right things?
So some businesses have a very good handle on, they've got a problem, for example, with attrition, or they've got a problem with landing people and getting them on board. So forget whether they're using a recruiter or not, just quite simply that business can't compete with its own competitors to hire talent. And often you can narrow that down to employer brand, those sorts of things. What I often say to people is, before you get to that point, work out what you're trying to achieve and what is the cost, if you can, of the overall project. For example, if a business is raising 5 million quid, the objective is clearly not to spend 5 million quid. The objective is that 5 million was meant to get to somewhere in the strategy. What is that and what's the cost of it? And by the way, if you don't achieve it, does it mean that you'll do it slower, or does it mean you might actually never ever do it because you've got a competitor who's going to hit that window quicker? And so really it's about getting a number on the size and kind of importance of the project that you're working on. And if that project is literally, it's a 3-year plan to grow from 1 million to 10 million pounds, that's a huge amount of investment and time, and I presume upside for the owners of that business. Therefore, what's it worth to the individual? What's the cost of taking a year to hire the most important hire they've got, whether that be an FD, a sales and marketing director, you name it? What's the cost of spending all this money on hiring? And actually, a year later, 40% of these hires have left, which is not an uncommon stat if you grow too quick. What's the cost of not even having this data? That's an interesting one we're making. So we're in our earlier phases of actually turning this into actual formal consultancy that we do for clients. One of the interesting ones is we don't even know where that data is. You'd have to help us with it. And you think, we're actually starting to measure what the likely, compared to their turnover and profit and their objectives, what's the likely saving that they could make just from the fact that they've admitted they don't even collect the data on time to hire, how quick they can hire, how much attrition they've got, what's the staff turnover in certain areas, what's the performance across different parts of their business, down solely to the way they treat people, that sort of. So yeah, it's just a lot of questions, and some people aren't up for it. I get that, but anybody who's really serious about this, who's got a serious amount of money on the table, will be very interested. Anybody who's, I guess, saying the right things about growth probably is really scared underneath as to what this could cost them. Because as you know, growth can be brilliant, but growth can send a business under in a year, 2 years, no problem if it's done badly.
Months.
Well, yeah.
I've seen it happen. Do you think there's businesses should, or organisations should, be looking at other things, maybe measuring, maybe not? Obviously, recruiting is one aspect of what becomes the organisational culture. It's a huge part of it, but there's management, development, the communication, the list goes on. Do you think there's other aspects of the whole people part of the organisation that comes into culture that isn't quantified or isn't given due attention that should be?
Yeah, I think, well, we call it the people pillar of a business. So when a business says, oh, we're a people business, or we're in a sector which is very people are critical, I mean, I think there's a lot more than the amount of touch points we've already found, but we're at about 110 touch points, which are literally from the first point somebody might have heard of you that might think about working for you. So that could be something on social media, that could be a job advert, that could be a friend in the pub saying about how fantastic it is to work at that business. It could be all these different areas, right onto what the interviews are like, how long is it between interviews, what's the perception, does every senior manager give the same perception of that company, or at least their own story, through to a lot of businesses are great at landing people, but then kind of when they join, how good your induction, how sort of loved do people feel when they're coming up to probation, a year in, how keen is everybody still to work there, from because there's a graph which I'd happily share, which basically shows how bought in somebody is from the moment they got offered the job to 1 year, 3 year, just as an average, global average.
Yeah.
And it's incredible how that drops off. You've really got somebody at the point where you've offered them a job and they haven't even joined you. You've got somebody there that in that next 6 to 12 months, it's the most powerful period you could use to make them your vision and mission and values. But after that, a lot of it, like you say, it's the nuts and bolts, it's the training, it's the development, it's what, and then it's understanding why did people leave. Everybody knows exit interviews are nothing new, but who uses that data properly that actually says, do you know what, we consistently lose 25% of our staff because of X, Y, and Z, and look at recurring themes and that sort of stuff. So, sorry, long-winded answer there, but basically,
No.
that is all the data that I'd gather, and I would estimate that if it's 110 touch points we look at now, I reckon it'll be 200 by Christmas.
Right.
And we run a model with a client, they come up with another problem that they've identified that we've either not thought of, or it kind of complements quite nicely with what we're doing.
I see. I couldn't agree more. I've had that conversation a lot recently when we're trying to assess this whole area and assess what might need to change. And we start talking about, do you have this information, this data, and it goes beyond almost the basic anything beyond basic statutory compliance. Ultimately, it just isn't there. Would you say that that's ultimately what you would like to see change across organisations generally, or if you were looking to make improvements within your own business, with industry, within businesses, organisations as a whole, what changes would you like to see, and what would be the most important or prioritise?
The most important thing to realise is there's a lot of businesses I don't think this really matters to, and I touched on it when we were speaking earlier about Apple. If your product and your business and your technology is so strong, this isn't about fluffy pool tables and ball pits and all that sort of stuff. Literally about, for me, in the same way you as an FD, a finance man yourself, you've looked at businesses for far longer than I have that look at why they perform. I think it's down to, are you really a people business? Do you really need to be a people business? And is it or isn't it that important? And that's also totally fine.
Yeah.
Because you can be the best business in the world without having kind of softer touch points and make sure you retain people. Where I would say the priority becomes is, if that's your only competitive advantage is having better people, which for a lot of businesses it is. I can think of many law firms where they're a challenger brand, not the biggest accountancy firms. It's a great example, isn't it? Or you're probably never ever going to have a bigger brand than them. So how do you compete? You have better people which offer better service and that sort of thing. So I think it's those service sector people-led businesses where the priority has to change. The legal sector itself, as we know, has had massive change over the last 10 years. And some have been forced to go down the commodity law route. Some have gone down the route of becoming really high end. But I just don't think you can stand still. And I think for people like that, this data analysis is going to be absolutely critical. It's going to be as important as an accountant looking through their P&L is how strong is your HR transformation team at understanding the data within your business.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And do you think that would apply to, we're kind of discussing here a bit more around the kind of private sector and profit make business, but what about your government departments, charity sector, non-profits? Do you think it's just as applicable and important?
So I think it's definitely as important, and it's definitely as applicable. For me personally, in terms of our client base, that's not a space we play as heavily in. And I think with what we're doing, I think as well, that might be something that we don't expand into with a sort of analysis and consultancy wraparound with Adam. I think the problem you've got is, it's all well and good having the data for people, but they've got to be a business that's serious about using it really for us to be interested. But that's not to say somebody else wouldn't be doing it, or certainly if you work in the big four, KPMG and PwC and people that already do kind of some of the stuff we do, they just do it for much bigger businesses. So definitely think there is a huge market there. I definitely think they need it possibly even more than anyone else.
Right.
But I think you've got to know what you're dealing with there. If you're trying to bring change basically to the NHS or a large organisation, it's going to be a far bigger challenge than changing a private sector business that's currently number 3 in their market and they want to be number 1 by improving their people pillar.
We've covered quite a lot already. If people who are listening to the podcast and they're facing these challenges, and where have you learnt the most? Where do you, people who want to find out more, do a bit learning, understanding, try and find some practical tips to get involved? Have you learned everything and as you've gone along just by finding the best way, or do you think there's stuff out there that people should be getting involved in or listening to, reading, etc.?
I think there's a lot of reading material. If you look on any social media around HR analytics, if you're around culture, around employer branding, that kind of thing, there's a lot of specialists as well as people who built whole businesses around. I mean, the culture consultancy is one that we've worked with. That is all they do, and they are brilliant at it. So
Right.
I think that's kind of it. On a professional level. If you're saying how does somebody tomorrow go and work on their culture, that's really where I'd point them to begin with. The bigger picture of data and understanding that to improve your culture, I think, is a longer term, bigger financial investment, bigger commitment, and doesn't probably suit everybody. But yeah, I'd just say you can read about it all day, but I'd go and talk to an expert. It's yeah, without sounding ridiculous, it's like you're ill. You go and see a doctor. You could spend 2 years reading up about cancer.
Yeah,
You'd just go and see a doctor, wouldn't you? And I do think there's great businesses out there that work with culture and employer branding fantastically.
I think you're right. I've started to get, as you well know, I started to get more involved in that whole area myself, coming from my non-people based background, but a business owner, I would say. So, but starting to work with Vimmer at Honey Badgers certainly opened my eyes to a lot of that stuff. Been really interesting. Okay, well, that's pretty much everything. I think we've covered quite a lot there, really. Is there anything else that you think might be of interest to anybody listening?
I think the only one is obviously what's gone on in 2020. I think
Yeah,
we mentioned the C word, but we've probably not touched on agile working and the impact of that on culture. I think
yeah,
it's really new to us and really new to a lot of businesses, but it's not new to everybody. And big international, particularly American software firms I can think of, where agile working is phenomenal. But I just wonder where that will take culture and
yeah,
boarding and that sort of stuff. Certainly for our business, my main sort of concern this year was that people just wouldn't hire because they didn't feel comfortable doing that without that kind of human interaction. And that's obviously changed radically. So yeah, it's just going to be interesting to see where next year and beyond goes with. If you've got a great culture, you're trying to build a great culture, but now everybody or 90% of your staff are agile, flexible workers.
mm,
That just adds another layer for me of, well, it's opportunity on the one end, but lots of opportunity also to get it wrong, being honest.
yeah. What are you actually seeing? I was actually going to mention that actually earlier and didn't pick up on it. Obviously, are you seeing a change in the way that businesses are going about it? Do you think it's on balance? Do you think it's more positive, more negative? What are you seeing in probably good and bad examples of the way that culture's changing?
Yeah, I think it's probably too early to say how much this year has impacted, but it's where it's definitely been a huge positive is people are now having to be open-minded about, well, I'm not going to meet the person who's getting the job down south that normally I'd go and have a day in London with them. It's going to be done on Teams or Zoom. So those obvious changes are happening already. I think it's about how do they knit them into the business? How do you make sure that firstly you're on top of these people and giving them the development they want, giving them the management, but how are you spotting the problems that normally you might see sort of incidental learning, you might see somebody who's struggling, you might physically be in an office with them. So the positives are there, but I think there's the negatives. It's probably too early to say, but there will definitely be stories of businesses.
How are you managing that? Are you, with you're obviously you becoming more open to recruiting business people from, non-local employees, or are you finding it? How are you finding it on a kind of personal level?
So the team have been amazing. So most people have reacted brilliantly to agile working. So the short to medium term has been probably a good thing really for us because there's certain clients now that would happily meet people and talk to us without setting lots of interviews where they have to go and travel and all that.
Yeah,
So I think that's positive. But the biggest positive, if we get it right, is that we don't have to hire anymore in a certain location for ourselves, which means we can now get regional expertise with somebody who works remotely, who can also do their hiring remotely. So I guess there was a little bit of old-fashioned. So yeah, so as I was saying, the real long-term opportunity is, I think, being able to actually hire people for ourselves that are both in their own right remote workers, but they'll then have their own regional network, and then on top of that, a client base who we were quite old fashioned with. We would like, for good reason, we'd want to meet the client, we'd want to meet the candidates. And that was kind of one of our selling points that, we're not just a CV shop, we're out there hiring. So, from a recruitment perspective, I think we can bring the same quality by using technology just because everybody's adopted it overnight. There's not this snobbery of, well, these guys have told me that they're based locally in Frankfurt and you're not, therefore we'll use them, not you. So, I use that location just because I've done work in Western Europe and they are particular about where you're based. So there's a lot of positives, but I think there's going to be a lot of change next year on top of this year. I think when people want to get back to some sort of normality, which is hopefully not too far away, we'll start to see really who's made those strides and who's been left behind by what's gone on in 2020.
I see. What do you think that might look like then when you say, we'll see who's made those strides, and what do you think 2021 might look like, for example?
So I think there's businesses that we hire for who have absolutely pushed on now, who are hiring actively, they are transforming their business, they're hiring HR transformation teams, they are very, very serious about their growth, and they're in the right market as well at this time. They're not struggling. And yet we're also working with people who are kind of treading water, hoping that it'll just lift and we'll come out of it next year. So inevitably, I think there'll be markets that they've got a different market leader. A challenger brand is now the market leader. You've got businesses that were market leaders that will go under.
Yeah.
And even, there's the obvious ones like the airlines and the travel sectors, obviously massively shaken up, but even less extreme ones than that. There's been a lot of change in e-commerce this year. It was very much at one point 2 or 3 major e-commerce platforms. I can now see 4 or 5 emerging that seem to have just emerged ridiculously quickly into the e-commerce space. So anybody who's taking their business online now has got a lot more options. So I think it's going to be huge. I think next year will be, obviously it's going to be tempered a little bit with what's going on this year, but I think it'll be the first year where we start to see how big the change was this year.
What do you think the impact on that will be on on organisational culture? How do you think will changed in that regard?
So start with the negative. I think there's going to be a lot of businesses who are coming back out, rebuilding their employer brand because they have inevitably had to make lots of redundancies. So there's a transformation opportunity there to say, we're back, we're hiring, we're growing, and kind of the work there. And there's other businesses who quite literally are mopping up the talent who can't hire fast enough. And it'll be seeing how they get on next year and what that looks like for them. And some of them, by the way, I'm not talking about like cutting edge technology. Some of these businesses I'm referring to are industrial businesses that have been around for 50 or 100 years that are X generation down in terms of family ownership. But they've just decided this is the year they've got to change, and things that they've probably been lagging around and stalling on, they've been forced to make massive change in 2020. So hopefully that'll be where all the positives are.
That's interesting. Well, I think there's only the final question that we ask of all our guests, just for a bit of fun, really, is that you might know our organisation, our company is called Honey Badger. There's a YouTube video that makes us all laugh that brought us together, but also there's some genuine thought behind it in that they're very fearless, powerful, intelligent creatures, and it's something that we try and build those kind of values and characteristics through the whole organisational culture. So, sort of note, we ask everybody, if you were an animal, which one would you be and why?
I have to be honest with you, I've always been fascinated by golden eagles. I just think the fact that they can fly so far, so high, and they can see everything, I think it probably tells you a lot about how nosy I am and how I like to be able to see everything. But yeah, no, it's quite a funny question, that. Thanks for having me today. I really appreciate it.
No, that's been really interesting. I got a lot out of it, and I'm sure everybody else will. So thanks very much, and I'm sure I'll speak to you again soon, Richard. Cheers.
Absolute pleasure. Cheers, Gareth.
So that's all for this episode of CultureCast. I really hope you enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed recording it. If you like this episode, feel free to visit thisishcd.com, where you can access our back catalogue of over 100 episodes, with episodes related to service design, product management, design research, and much more. If you want to get in touch with me or any of my guests, then please do get in touch using the details on the podcast show notes. Thanks, and hopefully I'll speak to you again soon.